Today we're going to subtract rational numbers. We're going to use the same process we did when subtracting integers. Whenever we see a subtraction problem, we're going to change it to an addition problem by using our rule, add the opposite. So when I see a subtraction problem like -6 minus 5, the first number, -6, stays the same. I'm going to change my subtraction sign to addition, and the number after the addition sign becomes its opposite. The opposite of 5 is -5. In this problem, 8 minus 13, 8 stays the same. My subtraction changes to addition, and the number after the addition sign, 13, becomes its opposite, -13. And finally, -5 minus -5. The first -5 will stay the same. My subtraction sign becomes addition, and my second -5 changes to its opposite, +5. Once I have changed all of my subtraction problems into addition, I'm going to follow my addition rules. So the first addition rule was if the numbers we're adding have the same sign, we're just going to add their absolute values and use that common sign for our answer. So here, -6 and -5 have the same sign. I'm going to add their absolute values. 6 and 5 is 11. And I'm going to use that common sign, the negative, with my answer. Another addition rule was if the numbers I'm adding have different signs, I'm going to subtract their absolute values, and the sign of whichever number has a greater absolute value is also going to be the sign of my answer. So here I have +8 and -13. Different signs. If I subtract them, 13 minus 8 is 5. And since 13 had the greater absolute value and 13 was negative, my answer will be -5. My last rule is that if I'm adding opposites, the answer will always be 0. So here -5 and 5 are opposites, so when I add them together, I get an answer of 0. Let's subtract some rational numbers. So here I have a problem involving fractions. I've got -4 and 1/7 minus -6/7. The first thing I did here was using my add the opposite rule, I changed this to addition. I made this add and the opposite +6/7. So here's my new problem. These guys luckily have the same denominator, so I'm already ready to go. All I need to do is take this mixed number and change it to an improper fraction. So 7 times 4 is 28, plus 1 is 29, so it's 29/7, and I carry that negative down. So now I have -29/7 plus 6/7. -29 plus 6 is -23. My denominator carries over. Since this is my final answer, I am going to put it back in mixed number form. So I carry down my negative. 7 went into 23 3 times with 2 left over, so my final answer is -3 and 2/7. On this problem, I have 4 1/2 minus 5 1/4. So the first thing I'm going to do is change it to addition by making my subtraction sign an add sign, and I'm going to make this second fraction its opposite. The next thing I need to do here is get a common denominator. So I'm going to use a common denominator of 2. I'm going to make this guy 4 2/4. I'm sorry, a common denominator of 4. After I have my common denominator, I need to change these guys into improper fractions. So 4 times 4 is 16, plus 2 is 18. This will be 18/4. Here I've got a negative. I just carry that negative down, and then I don't worry about it. I'm going to just change this to an improper. 4 times 5 is 20, plus 1 is 21. Now I'm ready to add. 18 plus -21 is -3. And I carry over my denominator. So my final answer is -3/4. Rational numbers are not always fractions. Here are some in the form of decimals. I've got -8 and 4/10 minus 7 and 6/10. So first thing I did was change it to addition. I made it add -7 and 6/10. Now that I see they're both negatives, I'm just going to add them because they have the same sign. So 8 and 4/10 and 7 and 6/10 gave me a total of 16.0, or just 16. And since they were both negative, I'm going to use that common sign with my answer, and my final answer will be negative 16. Let's try one together. I've got 12 and 8/10 minus 21 and 62/100. I'm going to change this to an add problem. I'm going to do add the opposite. So I have a positive and a negative. So I'm going to subtract them. The one with the greater absolute value will go on top. And if you ever have an empty spot, fill that in with a 0. It's really important your decimals line up, and any empty spaces you fill in with zeros. 2 minus 0 is 2. 6 minus 8 requires me to borrow here. 16 minus 8 is 8. Bring down my decimal. 0 minus 2 I have to borrow again. 10 minus 2 is 8. And 1 minus 1 is 0. So I've got 8.82. Since my larger absolute value in the problem was negative, my answer is going to be negative 8 and 82/100. The last thing I'm going to do is find the distances between some numbers on a number line. Now I'm finding distances, so they're going to be positive. We don't have negative distances. So it's important that when I write my problem, I'm going to put my problem in my absolute value symbols. So I'm trying to find the distance here between 2 and 1/3 and negative 2 and 3/4. So to find the distance between them, I'm going to subtract. It doesn't matter which number I start with, because ultimately I want to find the absolute value of that problem, because I'm finding the distance. So I started with 2 and 1/3 and subtracted negative 2 and 3/4. Change that to an addition problem, and I've got 2 and 1/3 plus 2 and 3/4. So I changed these guys both to improper fractions, and I had 7/3 plus 11/4. I need a common denominator, so I went with 12. After changing these guys, I got 28/12 and 33/12. Add those together and I get 61/12, or 5 and 1/12, and the absolute value of 5 and 1/12 is 5 and 1/12. So these two guys have 5 and 1/12 spaces between them. So let's try this one together. Finding the distance between negative 3 and 5/10 and 1 and 25/100. So it doesn't matter which one I start with, as long as I'm putting my expression inside the absolute value symbols and finding a distance. So I'm going to start with negative 3.5 and subtract 1.25. I'm going to make this an addition problem. So I'm going to add the opposite. So I'm adding 3.5 and 1.25. They both are negative. They have the same sign, so I can just add them. I line the decimals up, put a 0 in here as a placeholder, and I get 4.75. But remember, they were both negative, so my answer will be negative 4.75. Since I'm looking for the absolute value of this problem, I'm going to have 4.75 as my final answer. There's 4 and 75/100 spaces between these two numbers on the number line.